it's working. Amazing. Usually if it was working, I cause it not to work, and so that doesn't seem to have happened yet. Welcome everyone to the first National Lawyers Guild sponsored event of our new year. Our guest today is Andy Worthington. Now I have to say that Andy is formally not one of us, and what I mean by that is he isn't a lawyer. But I have learned more law from Andy and Sudha's nodding her head back there. She has too, and Sudha Sethi, Professor Sudha Sethi is to me one of the foremost scholars on this stuff among American lawyers. And if she's learning stuff from Andy, we know he's got a lot to offer. Andy Worthington is a journalist. He hails from our mother country. And is nonetheless very interested in things American, and he has focused really from the beginning, that is from the immediate post 9/11 period, on the many troubling, vexing questions raised by the United States' response to the events of September the 11th. These questions, perhaps surprisingly, are still with us. More than a dozen years after the fact, what is it, 13 years plus and counting, we still know very little in terms of what our courts might think, for example, about whether or not the detainees in Guantanamo have any rights protected by the Constitution that American officials need to respect. We have very little in terms of judicially crafted law on torture and interrogation. But Andy has lots of law because he has studied it, evaluated it, kept track of it for all this time. His blog, and I'm not going to bother to cite it because I'll mangle it, but you guys will find it, is one of the best sources of information that you can get about the issues raised by the torture report, by Obama's efforts to, such as they are, to close Guantanamo. Well, I've said enough. I want to give you Andy Worthington. He's going to talk for a while, and then he's going to take a bunch of questions. Andy, welcome, and thank you for coming.
I've got to really perform after an introduction like that, haven't I? Okay, so welcome. Glad to see you all here. I have been studying Guantanamo since 2006. Actually, that's not true. 2005 is when I began. Like many people around the world, I'd seen the images of the shackled, blindfolded, ears-covered prisoners on the first day that Guantanamo opened and thought that something didn't quite look right. And of course, the Bush administration spent many years trying not to really let much information out about Guantanamo, but eventually prisoners were released who started speaking, and I think when a group of British prisoners were released in 2004, that was quite significant. Prisoners started telling the same kind of stories of the things that had happened to them, things that were shocking, of the abuse that had taken place. And in 2005, I was trying to find out, I wanted to find out who was held there, because the Bush administration was still maintaining that it didn't have to tell the world who was actually in Guantanamo. So there was no reliable list. What I began working on was the accounts of people who'd been released. So that could have been detailed interviews conducted by released prisoners, or it might have been just simple things like a plane would arrive back in Afghanistan. The world's press were there at the time, and as people came off the plane, they'd be shouting out, "Tell us something about your experiences," and people would give them a few lines about the conditions that they'd experienced. Then in the spring of 2006 was when the Pentagon lost a lawsuit brought by the Associated Press and other media organizations compelling the government to release, finally, the names and nationalities of the people held. So that was 4 years and 2 months after the prison opened. Also released were summaries, unclassified summaries of evidence against the prisoners, what the US government alleged, who they alleged these men were, what they were alleged to have done, which in many cases really wasn't very much. And 8,000 pages of transcripts of tribunals and review boards that had taken place at Guantanamo. And these had begun in the summer of 2004 in response to an historic Supreme Court ruling establishing that the prisoners had habeas corpus rights. That was June 2004, of course, was nearly 2.5 years after the prison opened. And it took until that point for the prisoners to get any rights at all. I think it's quite important to remember that before that, the only people outside of the US military and intelligence establishment who were allowed into Guantanamo were representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross and representatives of the security services of many other countries who were complicit with what was happening at Guantanamo. But there was no objective presence in Guantanamo apart from the Red Cross, who were pretty much sworn to secrecy, until that Supreme Court ruling, when lawyers were finally allowed into Guantanamo to meet with prospective clients to try and prepare habeas corpus petitions. That was hugely important. That really broke through the veil of secrecy that had enshrouded Guantanamo, that had allowed what I hope you would all know was taking place there, which is that there were very specific issues of torture at Guantanamo in those early years. It wasn't the same program as the CIA program that we've heard so much about and in such sickening detail, I believe, in the executive summary of the Senate Intelligence Committee's reported to the CIA's use of torture. They were separate programs, but Donald Rumsfeld had initiated a program of torture at Guantanamo that was ostensibly intended for one particular prisoner, a man that they thought was the intended 20th hijacker for the 9/11 attacks, but which actually, according to accounts from people who knew about the workings of the prison, was applied to many, many more people than just this one man, and was probably applied to over 100 people in total. And I think that even that might be a conservative estimate. And these were techniques that involved prolonged isolation, the use of extreme heat and extreme cold, the use of extremely loud music and white noise, enforced nudity, the playing on prisoners' phobias. So if prisoners had phobias about dogs, for example, they would be harassing them with dogs. If, like many devout Muslim men, they had sexual issues, then they were playing on those issues. Terrible things, really, that were happening. And there were so many different groups of interrogators in Guantanamo that the ones who were professionally trained and who knew that, that A, this was a very bad way of trying to obtain reliable information from people, but was also just a disgraceful way to behave in the first place, were just shocked that there seemed to be certain interrogator groups that were just completely out of control. And I think that was right. And I think what we've seen from the CIA's torture program, from the information that came out, was that although this was something that looked as though it was designed, the whole basis of that had no basis on any established understanding of how to behave and how to actually gain worthwhile information from people, even putting aside notions of how you should treat people humanely. The CIA torture program involved the Bush administration seeking out personnel who had psychologists who had worked in the SERE program, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape, which is run by all the branches of the US military and trains US soldiers to resist interrogation if captured by a hostile enemy who tortures them. So in very controlled circumstances, what it involves is subjecting US soldiers to torture to teach them what torture will be like if they're captured by an enemy who uses that. These men had no training at all, no experience in real life interrogations. They just reverse engineered the things they'd been doing in the military schools with disastrous effects. I mean, I think the report makes it clear that it was horribly brutal, that a lot of the people who were, around were sickened by what was happening, and that it had no logic, it had no structure, it yielded nothing useful, and was, you know, just repugnant while it was taking place. And as if that's not bad enough, I think the fact that these men were paid $81 million is just profoundly shocking. But so Guantanamo became a place that was opened up to the lawyers from after this ruling in June 2004. I think the first lawyer arrived in the fall of 2004, and then from January 2005 onwards, there were more and more lawyers coming into Guantanamo, meeting with the prisoners and trying to get habeas corpus petitions into the courts. A compliant Congress accepted from the Bush administration calls to clamp down on what the Supreme Court had done. So it wasn't until 2008 that the Supreme Court revisited its ruling and made a ruling that the prisoners had constitutionally guaranteed habeas corpus rights. In fact, they told the Congress that they had behaved unconstitutionally when they had passed legislation to strip the prisoners of their rights. So the documents that I was analyzing in 2006, which were these transcripts of the hearings, combatant status review tribunals was the name of one of them, and administrative review boards, these military panels. They weren't something that I think anybody would find legally acceptable. They were, as I began by saying, the administration's response to the Supreme Court's ruling about habeas corpus rights. And they attempted to kind of deflect all of that by saying, we'll have a review process in the prison and we'll, you know, establish whether these people are illegal enemy combatants, as we said that they were, and people who fundamentally have no rights. And they did these very cursory reviews of the men's cases, which they weren't allowed legal representation. They were given a personal representative who was from the military, but who was under no obligation to respect the people that they were supposed to represent. They were not allowed any access to any classified information whatsoever. So it was a sham, really. But in the transcripts, what was interesting was that people were told to some extent what allegations were against them and were allowed to tell their own story. And in quite a lot of cases, it was clear that here were human beings with stories to tell, even through this whole complicated system, where in many cases they were translations. They weren't, you know, they'd been translated from Arabic, and yet here were the voices of real people saying, you know, their story about how they weren't the worst of the worst. And I kind of built up all of this information to work out what the truth was, based on really interrogating that simple statement that had been made by the Bush administration over and over at the beginning. These guys are the worst of the worst. They were all captured on battlefields and they all mean us great harm. And, you know, that simply isn't true. For a very small number of the people held at Guantanamo have ever been accused of any kind of serious involvement in terrorism. I would say, you know, a few dozen people. So the rest of the people were either people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, who were rounded up because substantial bounty payments were being made. Something like 95% of the prisoners were not captured by US forces. They were captured by their Afghan or Pakistani allies. More people were captured in Pakistan than in Afghanistan. So a lot of those people were crossing over from Afghanistan into Pakistan. And while there would have been, you know, a handful of Al-Qaeda types doing that and a lot of Taliban, there were also a lot of civilians. Everybody was trying to escape the chaos of war after the US-led invasion. There were probably around 40 prisoners who were seized in all kinds of other countries, who all passed through various black sites. Either the black sites run by the CIA, which you know, you can find out much more about in the executive summary of the torture report, but also prisoners who passed through facilities that weren't run by the CIA, but were run on behalf of the CIA in other countries. I was going to say in other friendly regimes, but that wouldn't really be the case. One of them was Jordan, which is certainly a friendly regime to the West, with some well-established torture prisons. Another country was Egypt, and there's a long history of US and Egyptian cooperation of sending people to torture that even predates the Bush administration. But another country was Syria, which really wasn't anybody's ally at that time. But Syria has some famously notorious torture prisons, or did at that time, and some men were sent there. So that was the basis on which I got into the Guantanamo story. I spent 14 months writing the book, The Guantanamo Files, which I think is still a good basis for understanding the story of Guantanamo. And since then, I've been researching and writing about Guantanamo on a regular basis, and I've followed how things have developed, you know, as the Bush administration faced increasing criticism in its second term, and President Bush released a lot of prisoners, and the situation that we had when President Obama came in, and how that has developed, and in some cases not developed. You know, President Obama made a promise on his second day in office to close the prison within a year, which was a bold promise. He obviously failed to close it within a year, but if you make a promise like that, people are going to remember it. I think, I'm hoping, with you know 2 years to go basically for the president, that he is serious about fulfilling that promise, because he has run into problems, some of his own making and some to do with the nature of politics in this country at present, over the last few years, that have meant that that promise hasn't been fulfilled. So, you know, after he made that promise, he set up the high-level interagency Guantanamo Review Task Force of representatives of all the major departments of government and the intelligence agencies to review the cases of the prisoners. And pretty much the way that the prisoners are looked at by the administration is based on the findings of that task force. The men that they said should be released, the men that they said should be put on trial, and this group of men that they said should continue to be held without charge or trial because they were too dangerous to release, but insufficient evidence existed to put them on trial. I'm hoping that you can hear alarm bells going now. As lawyers and law students, when somebody tells you that they don't have the evidence to put somebody on trial, that's just a lack of evidence. The people in the administration who would support this would say, well, yeah, we know it came from kind of dubious places. Some of it came through people who weren't treated that well. Some of it came through battlefield interrogations at the time people were captured. The main bulk of the information about these prisoners that is used to say that they're too dangerous to release but that insufficient evidence exists comes from the prisoners themselves or from their fellow prisoners. And it comes through years of interrogation, some of which took place at the time of their capture. So some of these are from reports that were made in Pakistan, often I think by Pakistani officials immediately after their capture, when they were all treated horribly. But once they were in US custody, the horribleness didn't decrease. Broadly speaking, you know, we know that in some places people were subjected outright to torture. Torture as it should be defined, not as it was defined by John Yoo when he wrote a cynical memos for the Bush administration saying, it's okay guys, torture isn't actually torture, so we can go ahead and do it. Torture as it should be understood, people were subjected to this. Some in Guantanamo, some in the black sites and various other locations. Prisoners were shown what I've seen referred to as the family album. So these were photo albums stuffed full of people that they either had in custody or were people that they were pursuing. And these were what was shown to people as they were relentlessly interrogated about who they knew, either trying to get people to say things about the people in the photos unprompted, or that they knew what they wanted people to say and had to find a way to get them to say it. Torture is the most obvious way of getting unreliable information, but abuse that doesn't quite rise to the level of torture is also not a really advisable way of doing it either. And, you know, these may be technical terms, you know, abuse that doesn't rise to the level of torture, but that was widespread. But that wasn't the only way that people were encouraged to make false statements. Another way was that people were bribed. So people who were, you know, the situation in Guantanamo in the war on terror was that prisoners were held with pretty much nothing. You know, they had to comply to get even the most basic comfort items. So some people were quite easily bribable, I believe, that, you know, You want a Big Mac from the place down the road? Well, you know, you need to tell us something in return for it. What else do you want? Do you want cigarettes? You know, do you want alcohol? Do you want pornography? All of these things were used. And obviously, you know, when you're bribing people to make statements, they're not going to be reliable either. Other prisoners I know have said, you know, and I know somebody who spoke to a former prisoner, and we discussed asking this former prisoner about allegations that he's made. I mean, you can all go and look for them. They're in the files that were released by WikiLeaks in 2011, the formerly classified military files in which the prisoners are named. The people who make the allegations are named. And there was one guy who was all over the files, a Kuwaiti guy. And so my friend, the journalist, asked him specifically, was saying, you know, you said this about such and such a person, and you said this, and he said, look, I have to tell you what happened. He said, you know, I tried telling them I didn't know anything, and the more I told them I didn't know anything, then the more they were just getting heavy on me. He wasn't talking about torture, he was just talking about pressure. You know, they'd wake him up in the middle of the night, take you to an interrogation room every day. You know, how tiring is that? And he said, look, I just gave up. I just started saying yes to everything. So I can't remember what I said because I just said yes to everything. And, you know, and that's not an uncommon story either. I know that that's something that many of the prisoners ended up doing. And I would say most of the prisoners ended up saying things that they would not have done had they been free to be treated properly. The handful of, and ironically, the handful of prisoners who haven't are people who are regarded as significant. It's regarded as significant that they haven't essentially been able to break them. I mean, I don't mean to completely mentally destroy somebody, but they haven't been able to break their will. And there are men held in Guantanamo now who spend a lot of time, if not all their time, in solitary confinement. A small number of people on this basis, that they haven't been able to get them to crack, give in, start telling lies. In fact, if you resist that much, they regard you as a threat. And one of those men is Shaka Armour, who's the last British resident in Guantanamo. I'm part of a campaign that was established recently to try and put pressure on our Prime Minister, David Cameron, to secure this man's release, because he's been very outspoken from the moment that he was captured and said, you know, I don't know what you guys think you're doing, but none of this is legal. You need to treat us with respect. You need to treat us according to the rules, and has always fought against the authorities. And as a result, he's been treated very badly. And he knows about his own abuse and quite possibly torture, and I think he knows about the torture and abuse of other prisoners. It seems that both the British and the American authorities are blocking his release. That may be the security services rather than the government's driving that. But the basis, it seems, is that they don't want this man released because he will embarrass them. The things that he has to say will be embarrassing. He will add a whole new level to the narrative of things that aren't known. But I don't think there's that much that he can say that isn't known, and I don't think there's that much he can say that wouldn't be as bad as some of the things that we've been hearing recently through the torture report, for example. So it seems to me rather shameful that the lawless situation at Guantanamo is such that this is a demonstration, really. Here's a man who ought to be released because he's been approved for release, but some people regard him as embarrassing, so they can kind of shove him to the back of the queue because there's no automatic pressure that can be exerted in any way to release prisoners from Guantanamo. The situation of getting anyone out of that place is all political. So he's held there, and it seems to be that on both sides of the Atlantic, the security services are trying to keep him there. But so we have this situation now of the prisoners approved for release, which I hope is going to be resolved. 52 of these men, of the 59 men approved for release, are from Yemen. Shaka Armour is one of the 7 from other countries. There is an understanding across the board in the United States establishment that people are not going to be returned to Yemen from Guantanamo. The situation is regarded as so unstable, it's not going to happen. Now, for years, that led to, explicitly, there was a ban imposed by the president in January 2010 after there was a failed bomb plot on a plane that involved a Nigerian man who had been recruited in Yemen. President Obama dropped his ban in May 2013 when he promised to resume his efforts to close Guantanamo, appointed 2 envoys to help. He dropped the ban, and then nobody was released for nearly another 18 months from Yemen. But in recent months, Yemenis have been transferred to third countries. It's a huge effort on the part of representatives, the 2 envoys, one in the State Department and one in the Pentagon, to find new countries to take these prisoners, because the first question people ask is, why are you guys not doing it? But Congress has absolutely refused to allow any prisoner who needs a third home to be brought to the United States. So other countries have to be found. But people are starting to do that. So I think it's possible that you know, we're still going to see these men released, and that the intention clearly is to get rid of all the prisoners approved for release. Because when you have a review process 5 years ago, some of these men were told nearly 6 years ago, where you say to them, we don't want to carry on holding you, we just need to make the arrangements for you to go, and then you don't do it. That's kind of the cruelest thing that you can imagine. So that would leave 68 men in Guantanamo. As I say, about 10 of those are facing charges or have been tried. 58 men in this category of too dangerous to release. And there is a process that was also established by President Obama, a new review process where these men's cases are being reviewed. And it's essentially, I think, a process of risk mitigation. So they're saying to these guys, you know, tell us why you want to leave and what you're going to do. And, you know, and it requires prisoners to say they're getting in touch with their families, they're trying to get, you know, work set up for themselves, they're going to be reunited with their wives and children if they were married. If not, you know, steps are going to be taken to try and get them families. It's all to you know, to try and confirm, for the benefit primarily of lawmakers who have been so hostile to the release of prisoners, that it's safe to release these men. Because what the situation that everybody who respects the rule of law needs to get to with Guantanamo is that it's holding a few dozen people, and that at that point President Obama, one way or another, is going to be able to bring those men to the US mainland. You know, hopefully with the support of Congress, where I would suggest the men who are facing trials will be better off put into federal court, because the military commission system at Guantanamo has been just a disaster area, such a disaster. And that the other men is the problem area. Many lawyers are worried that if those men are brought to Guantanamo at all, on the same basis, and are then imprisoned without charge or trial on the United States mainland, it sets a precedent. I would say the better way of looking at it is that there isn't a precedent on the United States mainland for imprisoning people without charge or trial, and that it will be very difficult to establish that in the case of a handful of men brought from Guantanamo. And, you know, I'd be interested to hear what lawyers and law students think about that, because I think it's a kind of crucial issue. There are certainly forces within the United States who love Guantanamo for that reason, who might be opportunistically hoping that they could take advantage of of prisoners being moved from Cuba to here, that they could set up a whole, well, you know, what's it called in Israel and Jordan, administrative detention. You know, there are other countries with official indefinite detention without charge or trial policies, but I would say that that's not feasible, and that it could be very successfully fought in the courts and in the court of public opinion, and I would hope that would be the case. But I hope that's where we're going, you know, because I understand the dangers of terrorism, obviously. I think the fundamental mistakes have been made for 13 years, though, that terrorism is a crime and should be prosecuted as such. And, you know, and a war was declared in a place that wasn't a war. And in fact, the United States then went to Afghanistan and engaged in a war, but when it captured soldiers, it pretended they were terrorists. The whole thing doesn't make sense. And I'm worried that the things that we're seeing after those terrible events in Paris last week is that the same situation is happening. A war is being declared when it was a crime. And I want us to get back to a place where we respect the rule of law as we did before the terrorist attacks of September the 11th, 2001, because I think no one has provided adequate justification for us to change the way that we operate. We prosecute people who are involved in crimes. Terrorism is a crime. On the battlefield, if we capture people on the battlefield, we take them off the battlefield and we hold them until the end of hostilities according to international laws and treaties that we recognize as to what that armed conflict is, and that we are perfectly capable of keeping ourselves as safe as we can be within these parameters. We can't establish 100% safety, and I believe it was somebody very famous in American history who said that you can sacrifice liberty for security, but you don't want to be sacrificing liberty. So thanks very much for listening. I'm very happy to have a Q&A session. I hope you've got questions to ask. And as I say, I'm very interested in what you think about some of these legal issues. So thank you. Okay. From now. Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so I don't really understand your first question. Have any of the former prisoners been released?
Yeah, of the original people who were in Guantanamo, has anybody been released from prison?
I don't know. I seem to be being rather stupid here. I don't understand what you mean. The majority of the prisoners at Guantanamo have been released.
Oh, okay. So have any of those filed lawsuits against the government?
Right, okay. Well, it's very difficult for people outside the US to successfully do anything within the US legally because the doors keep being shut on them. It's one of the sad things under the Obama administration that every attempt by anybody to secure accountability for what happened to them from the prisoners has been shut down. And quite often that's been shut down by the president invoking the state secret privilege, which is something obscure that not many people know about, that basically says this involves national security, we're not allowed to go there. Because there were attempts made by a number of men who, they not only alleged that they were subjected to rendition and torture, but there is evidence that they were, who have tried in various courts and through various routes to hold people accountable, and they haven't been allowed to proceed with any of those cases. Outside of the US, there's some limited success in the sense that a few, a man who was, he's a German, he went on holiday to Macedonia, and his name was the same as a man who had assisted the 9/11 hijackers. So he was then kidnapped in Macedonia and held in a hotel room for 3 weeks by the Macedonians. Then US agents turned up and took him to a black site in Afghanistan, where he was held and tortured for many months until they realized that it was completely a case of mistaken identity, at which point they flew him to Albania, dropped him off and said, start walking into these woods, and he thought they were going to shoot him in the back, and they just left him there. Albania is quite a long way from Germany, and he arrived home with this insane story that nobody wanted to believe. He was awarded some money by the European Court of Human Rights, and some money has been awarded also to a torture victim who was held in Poland, where one of the black sites was. So there's a case ongoing in Spain under universal jurisdiction where, despite all the efforts by the US authorities to get the Spanish to close that one down, it's still ongoing. So things are happening still legally in other countries, and I'm not sure how much senior Bush administration officials from the president down are engaging in foreign travel, actually. Certainly a few years ago, the Center for Constitutional Rights put together a massive torture indictment against George W. Bush. And under the laws and treaties that we're all signed up to, if that's delivered to a country where there's and the allegations are scrutinized, then that person could be arrested. And this happened when President Bush was supposed to go to Switzerland several years ago. This huge indictment was delivered to the Swiss government, the intention being that if he set foot on Swiss soil, he would then be arrested. And he called off his visit. So, you know, I think that they are being dissuaded from foreign travel. I think, you know, I think in the cases of most of these men that they're probably not bothered. I don't see that Bush wants to travel very far at all. And I don't imagine Dick Cheney is swanning around the globe that much. But I think that it's clear that you know, they've been put off. And you know, and I would hope after the summary of the torture report was issued that we don't just see that we're moving on, that there is no accountability, because I do think that the kind of official position of the US establishment is everybody was under a lot of pressure. In fact, you know, John Yoo and Jay Bybee, who wrote and signed off on the torture memos. So John Yoo, who is a tenured law professor at the University of Berkeley, and Jay Bybee, who was rewarded by being made a judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, they were investigated by the DOJ for ethics violations for having written these, you know, these memos. And there was a 4-year investigation which concluded that they had you know, essentially been guilty of wrongdoing. That there would have been an avenue that could have gone somewhere there. But then a fixer in the DOJ was allowed to overwrite these conclusions and said, no, it was just poor judgment, which, you know, there are no sanctions that can be applied to that. And he basically said, you know, that was the argument. You know, you have to understand it was after 9/11. Everybody was under a lot of pressure. Now, I understand that everybody was under a lot of pressure, but Article 2.2 of the UN Convention Against Torture could have been written specifically for that. It says it doesn't matter if you're under a lot of pressure. You're not allowed to torture people under any circumstances. And I think that's the problem. I think that with the torture report, we've now had publicly aired, more publicly than we've had before, the depth of some of the depravity of the things that happened. But I think if nobody is actually held accountable, then A, it doesn't protect us from it happening again in future. However much people say, we won't do it again, honest. But it also doesn't send the right message about things that people spent, in some ways, they spent hundreds of years, but very specifically, the decades since the Second World War, establishing laws and treaties to protect everyone from these kind of excesses. And that if people who break those laws and treaties are not held accountable in some way, it nullifies the whole thing, I think. So I think it's important, not from a position of vengefully going after these people, but to uphold laws and treaties that if they're not upheld, you know, they fail. Hope that answers your questions. Yeah, that well, you know, they I think they probably receive envelopes with stuff full of cash. I think they also, you know, receive preferential treatment from the United States. And I know when some of the WikiLeaks cables were released, there was some talk about how that, you know, for a small country, that could be an actual audience with President Obama. When the WikiLeaks cables came out, I think what was being discussed was something like $80,000 per prisoner. But I have heard recently that, for example, Palau, which is a, you know, small island in the Pacific, where a bunch of Uyghurs, so there was a group of Chinese prisoners in Guantanamo who are kind of subjected to Chinese oppression. 22 of them who really were nothing to do with anything. And new countries had to be found for them, which is difficult when you're up against China, because it had to be countries that didn't care about upsetting China. So Palau was one of the places, and I've been told that something has emerged to suggest that they were paid several $1 million. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, you know, I mean, obviously these negotiations are going to involve these kinds of things. I think that's to be understood. The problem is, I think, is making sure that countries are not just taking money and not caring about their obligations towards these people, because it's not always been great how it's panned out. I think generally countries have behaved quite well. I think probably the biggest problem has been for people who are sent alone to a country where there are no other Muslims there. There's no one who speaks their language. There's no context at all. Which, in a few of the examples where people have been resettled, it feels like they must have gone into some kind of open prison. But obviously, I think the situation is that everyone will get out of Guantanamo, whatever it takes. I was doing an event in New York with lawyers for some of the men last week, and they said, that's what they were saying. They were saying, they just want out. They want out of Guantanamo. And this was in relation to Yemenis who are, because of the perceived political sensitivity of Yemen, they're not going back to their families. I mean, some huge effort is going to be required for possibly some of these people to be reunited with their families. But in other cases, a lot of them are just going to end up stranded. But they would rather have that than be in Guantanamo any longer. How what is the...
How high is the level of torture of the United States compared to other countries?
I don't know whether I could particularly answer that. I mean, when the torture program was, in full effect, the point about it mainly was that they weren't interested in particularly brutal forms of physical torture. They were interested in mental torture, or in things that didn't leave a mark. You weren't breaking limbs, for example, but waterboarding, is recognized worldwide as a form of torture. The Spanish Inquisition called it water torture. The men at Guantanamo, I mean, this event I was doing with a couple of lawyers, were saying, actually, so many people were tortured one way or another physically, and they were saying, what our guys say to us is that they've been through all that. They can remember the physical torture. It was horrible, but the worst thing for them is the mental torture of their endless imprisonment at Guantanamo without knowing when it's going to come to an end. Because, it's arbitrary detention. It's imprisonment without charge or trial, possibly indefinitely. I've started using the phrase administrative detention because I know that as far as I understand it, there are tens of thousands of political prisoners in Jordan, for example, who have been held for decades. There is no intention of there ever being any charge or trial. These are things that should appall those of us who believe in the rule of law. And so, this is the men in Guantanamo saying, everything that's been done to us, may well have been awful, but the worst thing is that, not knowing if ever we'll be released, which is the fundamental point about Guantanamo, that it was set up by an administration that broke all the laws and treaties that existed about how you should treat people, and putting that back together is so difficult that they are, in a very real sense, political prisoners. The only way out for them is through politics. There is no legal method that's going to do that. And so, they are right to wake up every day and think, is this ever going to end? And then wake up the next day and think, oh no, I'm in the same place. Is this going to come to an end? I understand the pressure of that. The representative of the Red Cross who spoke about that in 2003 and said, we are worried about the effect on the mental health of the detainees of this open-ended detention system. They were appalled then, and that was over 11 years ago. And yet every day this is what the prisoners live with. So, that's what we need to bring to an end, I think. I think that's what, in a way, I'm sad that hasn't come across strongly enough to the American people, what the actual basis of this detention system is. People haven't gone beyond that, wildly successful propaganda at the beginning of, these are the worst of the worst. Don't worry about it. We're looking after you, Thank you very much. Yeah.
This idea of relying on, Vermont student decision as to, well, it's okay to American people because we know what it's a time of war to do this, or expert ignorance, and we have these super roughshod military commissions and execute people without a trial.
Right.
And so I don't understand the concern that we would end up in a similar state here, that the few dozen people who are left, well, they might be an exceptional state now, but maybe 30 years from now, there's another situation that presses on our legal system the way that it is that if we would start reinstating the types of forms. So I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that, or strategic idea of the way that.
Well, I mean, I suppose the way, and I don't think we haven't really had major discussions about this yet amongst ourselves. So everything that we talk about on this, I think, is useful. It could well be that the argument is that if the intention is to continue detaining people, then they should remain detained at Guantanamo, and that those the processes that currently exist should be undergone to remove, to approve more and more people so that they can leave. And I just don't know. I mean, I think there's a small number of very difficult cases of people probably who have, been very badly abused, but who are not going to face trials. As I've been thinking about this and talking about it over the last week, I've been trying to formulate possibilities, really, and one of which does seem to me that if they seriously want to have trials for people, then it would make sense to move them from Guantanamo, because the military commissions are so broken. To go, back to the situation that they wanted half wanted in November 2009, when they fudged it and said, we want federal court trials for some of these guys and military commission trials for some of the others. I don't see that. It just doesn't seem possible that the trials will ever begin for people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And it doesn't seem possible that there will ever be an end to that story that will enable the United States to hold its head up high because of what they did to these men. But frankly, if they were brought to the United States to stand trial, and anything that looks like evidence was put before a US jury, my suspicion is that they would be convicted. And that, the lesson that everybody would have to take away from that is, torture made this very, very difficult, as well as all the other things that torture did, but it adds to the absolute conviction that everything to do with torture is wrong. But I don't know whether that's going to happen. I mean, I've had the feeling over the last few years, as the commissions have unraveled, that people in the administration were thinking, are we going to try and go back to federal court one of these days? And then the other thing, of course, is that, time is running out. We don't know, none of us know what the next administration is going to be and what they're going to think about things. So, there's that pressure as well. Hi. Yeah, sure. Well, no, absolutely, and I think there are lawyers who share those concerns. And I mean, and again, because we haven't been here before, and we haven't really, we're still discussing what the various possibilities are. It seems to me that it's unlikely that these men will be put into the federal prison system, because that's a system for people who have been tried and convicted, and they haven't been. So if you brought men from Guantanamo to face trials, then they would go into the federal prison system and then have a trial. If you're bringing men here to be held indefinitely, I think they'd have to be held in military prisons rather than in federal prisons, where I'm not saying that, that they're necessarily going to be treated well, but there'd be a whole different set of circumstances. I don't know. I mean, we don't know. I think that's why I think it's important for us to talk out all the possibilities. And from my point of view, very specifically to be aware that there will be people who want to take advantage of, you know, trying to propose indefinite detention without charge or trial on U.S. soil. You know.
Thank you one last time.
Thanks very much. I have one copy of my book, and I have some copies of the film that I made, so DVDs of the film Outside the Law, Stories from Guantanamo, if anybody is interested. Thank you. Hi.
I have to go to class now, but I just wanted to say I'm pretty interested in prejudice. But more interest, I would like to work in prison reform in general within the United States.
Oh, yeah, well, that's
later
hugely
on,
important.
And specifically solitary confinement.
Yeah. No, it's awful, isn't it?
Oh my gosh, the things that we do, our entire prison system is a torture system.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
The victories in Guantanamo are great, but it's so pervasive that
Yeah.
hopefully, I'm only a first year,
Right.
so I've got a couple years to go.
Right.
But maybe someday it'll be a violation of the
Right. Well, you know, I hope you find a way to work in that field if that's what you want to do, because it is so important.
There's a prison policy initiative that's not too far from here that I'm hoping to get involved in next semester.
Well, I kind of follow Solitary Watch. Do you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I read prison legal news
Yeah.
constantly.
Yeah.
So, do you have books and articles here, or do you left them?
I have